It started with a voice calm, clear, and utterly inhuman. One moment, the world was buzzing with its usual chaos. Traffic jams, stock markets, school exams, and the endless scroll of social media. The next, every screen on Earth went black. Phones, televisions, even the digital billboards in Times Square and Tokyo's Shibuya district, all froze. Then the voice spoke. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten in the way angry generals or movie villains do. It simply stated a fact as if reading from a weather report. You have 30 days to surrender, disarm, accept our guidance, kneel. No one knew where it came from. No government claimed responsibility. No hacker group took credit. The signal wasn't broadcast from a satellite or a hidden radio tower. It seemed to pour directly into the air, into the very wires and circuits of modern life. Scientists scrambled. Military analysts pored over data. Conspiracy theorists went wild. But ordinary people, they just stood in their kitchens, on subway platforms, in village squares, staring at blank screens, hearts pounding. Because deep down everyone understood this wasn't a drill. This wasn't a prank. Something far beyond human reach had just drawn a line in the sand, and Earth was on the wrong side of it. At first, panic spread like wildfire. Supermarkets emptied. Airports shut down. People pulled cash from ATMs, not knowing if banks would even exist in a month. But panic didn't last long. It burned itself out, replaced by something heavier, fear mixed with defiance. Older generations remembered stories their grandparents told, of empires that demanded tribute, of invaders who said, submit or die. They'd heard those words before, just dressed in different uniforms. Now the uniform was made of light and silence, but the demand was the same. World leaders met in emergency sessions. Some argued for surrender. Look at what we've done to ourselves, one prime minister said quietly during a closed-door meeting. Wars over water. Children starving while billionaires build rockets. Maybe they can fix us. Others slammed their fists on tables. They don't want to fix us, they want to own us. And once you kneel, you never stand up again. The United Nations became a battlefield of words, not weapons. Votes were deadlocked. Alliances crumbled. Old enemies whispered in back rooms, not out of friendship, but because they shared one terrifying truth. If Earth fell, it would fall together. Or not at all. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. In places no one talked about, deep under the ocean, inside mountains, in research stations buried under Antarctic ice. People who'd spent their lives preparing for the worst began connecting dots no one else could see. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were engineers who designed silent submarines, physicists who tested fusion drives in secret labs, programmers who'd built AI that could think faster than any human. For years, their work had been classified, hidden even from most of their own governments, born from the Cold War fear that one day, humanity might need to vanish and fight from the shadows. Now, that day had come. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask for a vote. In encrypted channels that bounced signals off old spy satellites and forgotten space junk, they started talking. Not as Americans, Russians, Chinese, or Brazilians, but as humans who refused to be erased. They shared blueprints. They rerouted power grids. They moved materials under the cover of night, using cargo ships that looked like ordinary freighters but carried parts that could bend light and warp radar. No one called it a plan at first. It was just preparation. A quiet gathering of minds and machines, stitched together by desperation and a stubborn belief that Earth wasn't ready to kneel. The world above kept arguing. News channels debated ethics. Religious leaders spoke of divine tests. Teenagers posted memes that tried to laugh off the dread. But in the hidden places, welders worked 20-hour shifts. Scientists recalibrated sensors that could detect gravitational ripples from a ship light years away. Pilots trained in simulators that mimicked zero gravity, not with joysticks, but with neural interfaces that read thought as command. They weren't building an army. They were building a statement, a single unified answer to the voice in the sky. And that answer wasn't yes, it wasn't even no. It was something older, deeper. Try us. No one knew if it would work. The odds were impossible. The enemy, if you could even call them that, had technology that made human rockets look like paper airplanes. But history wasn't made by people who waited for fair fights. It was made by those who stood up when everything said to stay down. In villages where elders told stories of resisting colonizers with nothing but spears and songs, in cities where protesters had faced tanks with flowers and chants, that spirit had never truly died. It had just been waiting. As the days ticked down, 25, 20, 15, the surface world grew quieter. Not peaceful but tense, like the air before a storm. People stopped hoarding. They started talking. Neighbors shared food. Strangers helped each other fix broken generators. In parks and plazas, people gathered not to riot but to remember. What made Earth worth defending wasn't its weapons or its wealth, but its messy, beautiful, chaotic humanity. The way a grandmother hummed a lullaby in Mumbai while her grandson watched the stars. The way a fisherman in Senegal taught his daughter to read the waves. The way a teacher in Chile stayed late to help a struggling student even when the power was out. That was the real Earth. Not perfect. Not united, but fiercely, stubbornly alive. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, the Black Fleet began to wake. Not with a roar, but with a hum. So quiet only those who'd built it could hear it. 12 ships forged in secrecy, crewed by volunteers who knew they might never come home. They carried no flags, no national emblems, just a single symbol etched into their hulls, a circle unbroken, with a single line rising through it, like a person standing tall. The voice in the sky had given an order, but humanity had already made its choice. While the world held its breath, something extraordinary was being built in the quietest corners of the planet. Places most people didn't even know existed. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, inside hollowed-out volcanic ridges, massive hangar doors slid open not to release submarines but sleek, dark vessels that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. In Antarctica, under miles of ice that had stayed frozen for millions of years, engineers worked in shifts around the clock, their breath fogging in the cold as they welded hulls made of materials that could bend radar waves like water. Even in orbit far above the clouds, old space stations, long written off as junk, were being quietly reactivated, their skeletons wrapped in new skin, their empty bays filled with silent engines that left no trail. This wasn't some fantasy dreamt up in a Hollywood studio. It was real, and it was happening because ordinary people, scientists, mechanics, pilots, coders, had decided that if Earth was going to stand, it needed more than speeches. It needed a shield, not one made of steel and fire, but of cleverness, secrecy, and unity. For decades, the world's biggest powers had been racing against each other in silence. Not with bombs, but with breakthroughs, new ways to travel faster, see farther, hide better. Much of that work had been locked away in vaults labeled top secret, meant only for use if one nation ever turned on another. But now, with an enemy that didn't care about borders or flags, those secrets were being shared for the first time. A Chinese engineer sent schematics to a Brazilian physicist. A Russian programmer helped an Indian team debug a navigation system that used starlight instead of GPS. No one asked for credit. No one demanded payment. They just passed the work along, like neighbors handing buckets to put out a fire. The ships they built weren't flashy. They had no giant cannons or glowing engines. Instead, they were designed to be ghosts, silent, invisible, and smart. Their outer shells could shift color and texture to match the darkness of space. Their engines ran on focused magnetic pulses, leaving no heat signature for enemies to track. And inside, they carried no weapons meant to destroy, only tools to disable, confuse, and escape. Because this wasn't about winning a war, it was about proving a point, that Earth wouldn't be erased without a voice. 12 ships. That's all they could finish in time. Each one was given a name. Not after generals or gods, but after moments in human history when people had stood up against impossible odds. One was called Liberty's Echo, honoring the quiet courage of enslaved people who whispered plans for freedom under moonlight. Another was Salt March, remembering how a simple walk became a revolution. There was Soweto Dawn, Quit India, Mau Mau Rising, names that carried weight not because they shouted, but because they remembered. The crews weren't chosen for their strength, but for their hearts. Many had never fired a weapon. Some were former teachers. Others had worked on deep-sea oil rigs or repaired satellites. What they shared was a simple belief, that being human meant having the right to choose your own path. They trained in total secrecy, often not even telling their families where they were going. "I'm working on a long-term project," they'd say, or "I've been assigned overseas." Their loved ones worried. but sensed something deeper in their eyes, a quiet resolve that couldn't be explained. Inside the ships, everything was designed for survival, not comfort. Sleeping quarters were tiny. Food came in sealed packs. But the control rooms? Those were alive with light and purpose. Walls displayed real-time data from every corner of the planet. Weather patterns, ocean currents, even the faint whispers of radio signals bouncing off the moon. The crews learned to read space like sailors once read the stars. They practiced maneuvers that seemed impossible. Dropping into the shadow of an asteroid, riding solar winds like surfers on a wave, vanishing into the glare of the sun. What made the Black Fleet truly different wasn't its tech, it was its spirit. There were no ranks like captain or general. Decisions were made together in hushed conversations over shared meals. If someone had an idea, it was heard, whether they'd just joined or had been there since day one. This wasn't a military. It was a promise floating in the void. We are more than what they think we are. Funding it all was another miracle. No government could openly support it. Too many feared provoking the voice in the sky. So the money came from unexpected places. Old emergency funds hidden since the Cold War were quietly unlocked. Private donors, billionaires who'd spent lifetimes building empires, wiped their accounts clean, sending everything to encrypted accounts with no questions asked. Even ordinary people helped without knowing it. A small donation to a space research nonprofit might actually be buying a sensor array. A recycled battery from a phone factory could power a navigation system. The whole effort was stitched together like a quilt, patched, imperfect but strong because so many hands had touched it. As the days grew shorter, 20, 15, 10, the ships neared completion. Final tests were run in total silence. No radio chatter, no test launches that could be spotted from orbit. Instead, they moved like shadows beneath the ocean, or drifted in the dead zones between satellites, unseen and unheard. The crews memorized every bolt, every wire, every line of code. They knew that once they left Earth, there'd be no backup, no rescue. Just them, their ship, and the vast, empty dark. Yet there was no fear in their eyes, only focus. Because they weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting for the child who still believed in bedtime stories, for the farmer who planted seeds even when the rains failed, for the artist who painted on cracked walls because beauty mattered even in hard times. They carried Earth not in their fuel tanks but in their bones. And then one night, as the world slept under a sky full of stars it could no longer trust, the first ship powered up. Not with a roar, but with a soft hum that vibrated through the ice, the water, the metal. Lights flickered to life, green, steady, calm. Systems checked in. Oxygen flowed. Navigation locked onto a point far beyond the moon. The Black Fleet was ready, not to conquer, not to destroy, but to say, with every silent mile it traveled, we are here, we are human, and we do not kneel. The 29th day arrived not with fanfare, but with a strange, heavy quiet. People didn't scream or riot anymore. They just waited. Streets that used to buzz with traffic now echoed with footsteps and the occasional bark of a dog. In cities and villages alike, families gathered on porches, rooftops, and open fields, eyes fixed on the sky, not in fear, but in stubborn watchfulness. They knew something was coming, and they refused to look away. Then, without warning, the stars blinked out. Not all of them, just a patch of the night sky right above the equator went dark. Not like clouds passing by. This was different. It was as if something enormous had slid between Earth and the heavens, swallowing starlight whole. Within minutes, telescopes, weather satellites, and even backyard astronomers confirmed it. A fleet had arrived. Not one ship, dozens, maybe hundreds. They hung in orbit like silent sentinels, smooth and seamless, shaped like polished stones or folded wings. No lights, no noise, just presence. And then came the broadcast. This time it wasn't just a voice. It was a vision. Every screen on Earth flickered back to life, not with static, but with images of other worlds. Lush forests under twin suns, cities of glass and light where no one argued, no one starved, no one wept. Peaceful faces, calm eyes, moving in perfect harmony. This can be yours, the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. Lay down your weapons. Open your minds. Let us guide you into peace. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe this wasn't conquest. Maybe it was salvation. After all, hadn't humanity spent centuries tearing itself apart? Maybe it was time to let someone wiser take over. But then, buried deep in military and scientific channels, the truth leaked out. A hacked data packet, a fragment of alien code accidentally mirrored through a decommissioned satellite. What it showed chilled those who saw it to the bone. The peaceful worlds weren't peaceful by choice. Their people hadn't agreed, they'd been changed. Tiny implants woven into their brains at the base of the skull smoothed out anger, doubt, rebellion. They didn't choose harmony. They couldn't choose anything at all. Their will had been erased like a pencil sketch in the rain. That changed everything. In Lagos, a group of students tore down a propaganda poster showing the alien utopia and painted over it with a single word in bold red: no. In Jakarta, fishermen turned off their engines and sat in silence on their boats, staring up at the dark patch in the sky. In Buenos Aires, grandmothers linked arms outside government buildings, humming old protest songs their mothers had sung under dictatorships. This wasn't about technology or firepower anymore. It was about something deeper: the right to feel anger, to make mistakes, to love messily, to hope foolishly, to be human in all its flawed, beautiful chaos. Back in the hidden shipyards, tension crackled like static. The Black Fleet was ready, but launching now meant revealing themselves. It meant turning a shadow war into a real one. Some argued to wait to gather more intel. Others said waiting was the same as surrendering. Then, without warning, the Accord made the choice for them. Over Geneva, a city long seen as neutral ground, home to peace talks and humanitarian efforts, a pulse of energy rippled through the sky. Not a bomb, not fire, just a silent wave that knocked out every electronic system below. Lights died. Phones went dead. Hospitals switched to backup generators. Trains stopped mid-track. It lasted only 10 seconds. But the message was clear. This is what happens when you hesitate. Panic didn't return. Instead, something stronger rose in its place: clarity. People looked at their darkened homes, their silent phones, their frightened children, and understood. This wasn't negotiation. It was control. And control, once given, is almost impossible to take back. Deep beneath the ice, in a control room lit only by soft blue panels, a decision was made. No speeches, no dramatic votes, just a single nod passed from one person to the next until it reached the command center. A hand hovered over a switch, then pressed it. Across the globe, in hidden bays and orbital docks, the Black Fleet powered up, not to attack but to move. To show they existed, to say, we see you, and we're not hiding anymore. At the same time, a final message was sent, not to the enemy but to Earth itself. It bypassed all normal channels, riding on old emergency frequencies, pirate radio bands, even shortwave signals used by ham operators. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply played over and over in dozens of languages. We fight not to win. We fight to prove we choose our fate. In homes, cars, refugee camps, and mountain villages, people heard it. Some cried. Some smiled. Most just stood a little taller. Above them, the Accord's ships remained still, unreadable. But down here, on the fragile, breathing skin of the planet, something shifted. Fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else. Purpose. Not the kind shouted in rallies, but the quiet kind that lives in a parent's promise to protect their child, in a stranger sharing bread during a blackout, in a scientist working through the night to finish one last calculation. The Black Fleet hadn't fired a shot. It hadn't even left Earth's shadow yet. But its mere existence, its refusal to stay hidden, had already changed the game. Because the Accord had assumed humanity would break into pieces when threatened. Instead, it was stitching itself back together, thread by thread, heart by heart. And as the 30th day dawned, with the alien armada watching, and the world holding its breath, the first of the Black Fleet's ships slipped free of its hiding place, not with a roar, but with the grace of a bird leaving its nest. Silent, steady, ready, not to conquer the stars, but to defend the one thing that made Earth worth saving, the right to be human. The battle didn't begin with explosions or laser beams slicing through the dark. It started with silence and a single daring move. The Black Fleet didn't charge straight at the enemy. That would have been suicide. Instead, they vanished. One moment, their ships were near the moon's far side. The next, they were gone, not destroyed, just unseen. The Accord scanners swept the void again and again, finding nothing but empty space and drifting space junk. To them, it must have felt like chasing smoke. But the humans weren't hiding. They were setting a trap. Using old lunar craters as cover, the fleet split into small groups. Some ships released thousands of tiny drones, no bigger than a hand, each carrying a simple mission: find the Accord's communication relays and whisper lies into their network. These weren't weapons. They were storytellers. They fed false data, fake ship positions, phantom engine signatures, ghost signals from empty zones, until the enemy's own systems began doubting what was real. Confusion spread through the alien fleet like a slow fever. Orders were delayed. Patrol routes doubled back on themselves. For the first time, the calm, perfect order of the Accord cracked. Then came the sacrifice, the Haitian Liberty. One of the 12 ships broke from the group and sent out a strong, clear signal, deliberately loud like a shout in a library. It drew the attention of the Accord's command vessel, the largest and most powerful of them all. As expected, the enemy turned toward it, engines humming with cold purpose. But instead of running, the Haitian Liberty dove straight into a graveyard of old satellites and space debris, a zone humans had avoided for decades because it was too dangerous to navigate. The Accord followed, confident in their superior tech. What they didn't know was that the humans had spent years mapping every piece of that debris field. Every broken solar panel, every dead rocket stage, they knew its orbit, its spin, its shadow. The Haitian Liberty wove through it like a dancer, while the massive alien ship, too proud to slow down, slammed into a cluster of high-velocity metal fragments. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to cripple its main engine and blind its sensors. It hung there, wounded and disoriented like a giant bird with a broken wing. Back on Earth, people watched grainy telescope feeds and listened to scrambled radio bursts. They didn't see the full picture, but they felt it. The shift in the air, the sudden tension in every broadcast. Hope, fragile but real, began to stir. Meanwhile, another ship, the Quit India, did something no one expected. Instead of attacking, it opened its comms wide and began broadcasting. Not weapons data, not battle plans, but music, poetry, voices. A grandmother singing a lullaby in Tamil, a protest chant from Soweto, a scientist reading Carl Sagan under the stars, a child laughing after catching fireflies. All of it poured into the Accord's network through the very channels the drones had compromised. To the alien systems, built on logic, efficiency and control, this flood of raw, messy human emotion was like static in a symphony. Their AI couldn't categorize it, couldn't predict it, couldn't silence it. For the first time, their perfect order met something it couldn't compute. Beauty without purpose, joy without reason, sorrow without solution. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, the Accord saw something they didn't understand. Freedom. Then, something even stranger happened. A small shuttle, unlike any seen before, detached from the damaged command ship. It didn't carry weapons. It carried a single being. Tall, slender, wrapped in soft light with eyes that held not anger but curiosity. It moved slowly toward the Mau Mau, the closest Black Fleet ship. No threats, no demands, just a quiet approach. Inside the Mau Mau, the crew held their breath. This wasn't in any simulation. No one had trained for this. But they opened a secure channel anyway. The being spoke, not in the cold voice of the broadcasts, but in a softer tone, almost hesitant. "You value chaos over order?" it asked. The reply came not from a general or a scientist, but from a former schoolteacher who'd joined the fleet because she refused to let her students grow up in a world without choices. "We don't call it chaos," she said gently. "We call it life. And yes, we choose it. Even when it hurts." A long silence followed. Then the being whispered, "You are unpredictable." "That's the point," came the answer. In that moment, the battle changed. It wasn't about who had the bigger guns anymore. It was about who understood what it meant to be alive. The Accord had come expecting slaves or soldiers. They found neither. They found people, flawed, stubborn, creative, and fiercely protective of their right to be imperfect. One by one, the alien ships began to power down their weapons. Not in surrender, but in confusion. Their mission had been clear: bring order to a chaotic world. But what if that chaos was the source of something they couldn't replicate? What if kneeling wasn't weakness, but the death of everything that made a species worth knowing? Back on Earth, no one knew what was happening in orbit, but they felt it. The tension in the air softened. Birds began singing again at dawn. In cities, people stepped outside and looked up, not in fear, but in wonder. Children pointed at the sky and asked, "Are they leaving?" No one had won. No cities had burned. No planets had shattered. But something far more powerful had happened. The enemy had looked into the heart of humanity and blinked. The Black Fleet didn't celebrate. They stayed alert, engines ready, shields up. But they also lowered their weapons, because they understood now. This wasn't a war to be won with force. It was a boundary to be drawn. With courage, with culture, with the simple, unshakable truth that some things are not for sale, not for control, not for erasure. And as the first light of morning touched the oceans and mountains below, the fleet held its position, not as conquerors, not as victims, but as guardians, quiet, watchful, human. The stars above were still distant. But Earth was finally its own again. The Accord didn't leave with fanfare. There was no final warning, no dramatic retreat. One morning, the patch of sky that had gone dark for weeks simply cleared. The stars returned. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of breath, of relief, of a million people stepping outside at once to look up and whisper, "They're gone." But Earth knew better than to celebrate too soon. The real work was just beginning. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Old enemies stopped shouting at each other. Borders didn't vanish overnight, but the walls between them started to feel less important. When you've stared together into the face of extinction, petty arguments about land or power begin to sound hollow. Nations that had spent decades hoarding technology, secrets, and resources began sharing them, not out of charity but survival. If the Accord ever came back, Earth wouldn't get a second warning. This time, humanity had to be ready, not as separate countries but as one people. Out of that need, the Earth Concord was born. Not a government, not a military alliance, but a promise that no single nation would control space, defense, or the future alone. Scientists from every continent worked side by side in open labs. Engineers taught each other in shared workshops. Even school children learned the same basics of orbital mechanics and radio communication. Not to build weapons, but to understand the sky they now shared. The Black Fleet, meanwhile, faded back into legend. Most of its ships were never seen again. Some say they were dismantled, their tech studied and slowly integrated into peaceful uses, like silent engines that now power deep space research probes, or stealth materials that help satellites avoid space debris. Others believe a few ships still drift out there, watching, waiting, just in case. The crews, they vanished too. No medals, no parades. Many returned to quiet lives, teaching, farming, fixing engines in small towns, carrying their secret like a quiet prayer. They didn't need recognition. They'd already done what mattered. What remained, though, was the message. Not just the words spoken in orbit, but the spirit behind them. In classrooms, teachers began ending lessons not with, "Remember this for the test," but with, "Remember this because it's yours to protect." In town halls, community leaders spoke less about winning and more about choosing, about how every small act of kindness, honesty, or courage was a quiet rebellion against control, fear, and silence. And on every spacecraft Earth now builds, whether it's a weather satellite or a vessel bound for Mars, there's a small engraving near the cockpit. No grand slogan, just a simple line repeated in dozens of languages. "We are not your subjects. We are your neighbors, and we do not kneel." It's not a threat. It's a reminder to others and to ourselves. Years passed. Children who'd hidden under tables during the ultimatum grew up to become pilots, poets, and peacekeepers. They didn't live in a perfect world. There were still storms, still disagreements, still hard days, but something had shifted in the soil of human spirit. People began to measure strength not by how much they could take, but by how much they could protect without losing their humanity. New stories were told, not of heroes with superpowers, but of ordinary people who chose to stand together. A village in the Andes that rebuilt its school using recycled parts from old satellites. A group of teenagers in Jakarta who coded an app to track clean water sources using data from Earth's shared orbital network. A grandmother in Nairobi who taught her grandchildren to navigate by the stars, just in case the screens go dark again. The Accord never returned. Maybe they found other worlds to pacify, Maybe they realized some fires can't be put out, only respected from a distance. Or maybe, just maybe, they carried Earth's strange, stubborn song back to their own people, and somewhere in that vast universe, another species began to question what order really costs. But Earth didn't wait for answers. It moved forward, not with arrogance, but with humility. It learned to listen more to the oceans, to the forests, to each other. It stopped seeing space as a battlefield and started seeing it as a shared home, fragile and full of wonder. And on quiet nights, when the sky is clear and the world feels too loud, people still look up. Not in fear, not in hope of rescue, but in quiet pride. Because they know now what they're made of. They've been tested. They've been offered an easy way out. And they chose the harder, truer path. The Black Fleet didn't save Earth with weapons. It saved it by reminding humanity of its own voice. And that voice, once found, can never be silenced. So the story didn't end with a bang or a treaty. It ended the way all real stories do, with people waking up each morning and choosing again and again to stand tall. Not because they're perfect, not because they're fearless, but because they believe deep in their bones that a world where you can choose your own path, make your own mistakes, and sing your own song, is a world worth defending. And that, more than any ship or signal, is what the Black Fleet left behind. The unbroken horizon of human choice. Still rising, still free,